Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has now officially fired their commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny. Now, this has been rumored for a long time, and we've actually mentioned it a few times on some of our previous shows, but now it's finally happened. And I can just tell you, there was much debate and much discussion going on in the Ukrainian press, literally for months, going back probably close to a year ago. There was lots of discussion among the both the Ukrainian and Russian press about some disputes between the two men, especially over tactics and what they're going to do. And after months of rumors, and then especially in the last few days and weeks about, it's imminent, it's going to come, it's now happened. And the New York Times reported that here just a couple of hours ago, I believe it was, when they had this that's on their headline, to kind of confirm it for the Western audiences. And then shortly after that happened, Zelensky himself made a video to explain why he made the move.
Відсьогодні до керівництва Збройними силами України приступає нова управлінська команда. Я призначив генерал-полковника Сирського головнокомандувачем Збройних сил України. Очікую, найближчим часом на столі має з'явитись реалістичний, детальний план дій Збройних сил України на 2024 рік. Із врахуванням реальної ситуації на полі бою зараз і перспектив. Кожна бойова бригада на першій лінії повинна отримати ефективну західну зброю, має відбутись справедливий перерозподіл такої зброї на користь саме першої лінії фронту. Авдіївка не повинна чекати, поки генерали з'ясують, де у них на складах застрягли дрони. Кожен генерал має знати фронт.
Now, I'll kind of interpret some of those things for you and tell you what really he's meaning when he says some of those things, because he's referring to a number of reports that have been percolating, especially in the Ukrainian press for many months, and has been a source of complaint from a lot of the frontline soldiers. And I think that probably what Zelensky's trying to do is position himself that, hey, this hasn't been my fault. It was actually his fault. That's the reason that I fired him. Because obviously, if you're going to get rid of your commanding general in the middle of a wartime, you better have some good reason to do it, or people are going to think it's kind of weird and they'll be questioning your motives behind it. So he's trying to set out there. And there's at least three things he says in there. Number one is he said he wants a realistic, and he seems to emphasize that, detailed plan for this year, for 2024. What that stems from is toward the end of last year, there was lots of debate between the two that Zelensky wanted a detailed plan for what the plan was going to be to win in 2024, and he wanted an offensive sometime in the spring. Zaluzhny, who was looking at this much more realistically, realized that the best that they could probably hope for was to go on the defensive even before the end of last year, and then build their power over long term, which means there wasn't going to be an offensive. And so he didn't give him any plans for offensive. And this was a big source of conflict between the two. Now, I can tell you from a military perspective, I was saying that they should have done that probably last fall, maybe no later than August. They should have been going to the defensive then. And there was at least some reports that that's exactly what Zaluzhny was offering. Zelensky didn't want to go on the defensive. He wanted to continue this fiction that they were still on an offensive, which they had started in June and was a complete and a catastrophic disaster and failure. They achieved none of their even intermediate goals. Forget about strategic goals. They didn't get anything done, not even to the halfway point on any one of the three fronts where they opened up. And the commanding general, Zaluzhny, did not want to operate this. He was kind of forced into operating this way. He would prefer to have done some other things, but he was told he had to by the civilian leadership of the military, which is how things are supposed to work in a democracy. He did the best that he could, but he didn't agree with it. And what he recommended actually turned out to be accurate. What he was concerned about turned out to be accurate. Now, even before that, there was already some bad blood that existed at that point, because the previous year, around December, he had advocated abandoning Bakhmut when the then Wagner group had achieved basically three sides around the city, and he had about 10,000 men inside there. He wanted to redeploy them out to get them to the next line of defensives, which they had, and surrender that territory. But Zelensky was sharply focused on holding on to every inch of territory, every building, every floor of every building, not giving the Russians anything, making them, basically take it out of my cold dead hands kind of thing. And in fact, he actually said, and I believe Syrskyi was at one point tactically in charge of that fight, said they're going to hold Bakhmut. We will hold it at all costs. We're calling it our fortress. And as everyone now knows, that failed. They didn't. Not only did they not take the city, they didn't hold it. They lost the city, and they lost upwards of 70 to 100,000 men in the process, killed and wounded, because there were about 10 to 20,000 people inside of it. But because they didn't want to lose it, and Russia was clearly methodically moving in that direction, they kept sending reserve after reserve after reserve in there to hold it, reserves that Zaluzhny had planned on using for his offensive. Now, as I've covered in a lot of detail in previous videos, that the plan never had a chance, even if they had all of those troops, but at least they might have gotten a little bit further. But as it turned out, they got nothing. They lost the city, and they lost all the troops and the reserves. It was a catastrophic strategic error, and Zelensky is trying to push that off on Zaluzhny. That's the bottom line, because Zelensky is the guy in charge who makes the call about what they do and what they don't do. It went bad. Now then, you fast forward to the current offensive, or the offensive this summer, which, as I pointed out, Zaluzhny wanted to do something different. When he saw it wasn't working, he wanted to go on the defense, which made sense militarily, because you start digging in these long defensive lines like the Russians had done the previous year. Now you make it much more difficult for Russia to break through anywhere. You preserve your manpower, and then you can start maybe building for a future offensive, maybe 9, 12 months away. That's what would have made sense. But again, Zelensky didn't want to give up anything, even the fiction that they were still in an offensive. So they continued to go forward. They continued to lose men. So they were throwing wave after wave of people into these offensive that were clearly not going to win, not going to succeed. And again, it is really fundamental military practices is why it wasn't. Ukraine didn't have enough air power. They had hardly any, as a matter of fact. They had significantly shortages of air defense. They had some, but not near enough to cover their strategic targets deeper in the rear and the front lines. They didn't have enough armored vehicles. They didn't have enough training on those armored vehicles. And probably the most critical is they didn't have enough mine breaching equipment, not enough engineering equipment. So they got slaughtered on the minefields. They then did the only thing they could do, and they dismounted their troops and went up on infantry so they could go around the anti-tank mines, for example. And they made a couple of, very small advances up there, which was always going to be insane from my perspective from watching it, because with the infantrymen, you can't take, 100 kilometers against an enemy that's dug in. You just can't do it. All you can do is get some incremental gains here, which they did. Those didn't pan out. They ran out of steam. And now then, because the Ukraine side didn't set their defenses in depth back in, say, August or September, now that they're scrambling to try to get it done now, but now then they're about to lose Avdiivka. And again, Zaluzhny wanted to avoid the problem of Bakhmut and to get the troops out of Avdiivka probably a couple months ago at least. And again, Zelensky said no. And it appeared that it came to loggerheads. And so he never gave Zaluzhny didn't give Zelensky a detailed plan, because he said, there's nothing to give you. All we need to do is defend, or we're not even going to be able to win. Zelensky didn't want to hear that, so he got himself a new commander. The other thing is, he said the combat brigades should all get Western weapons, and they should be evenly divided, because there was a lot of complaints that some of the units didn't have any of the Western kit. They had all the old Soviet stuff. And then some of the frontline units didn't have gear. I think Zelensky is trying to put that on the shoulders of Zaluzhny, like that was his fault. It's the reason why that they didn't have that stuff is not because it wasn't there and it wasn't equitably division. It was because Zaluzhny didn't do it right. Whether that's true or not, I can't completely say, because I don't know how all that stuff is divided up. But that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to blame it on him. I rather think the issue is mainly they just didn't have enough, because they have 600-mile front that they have to try and cover. And the Western countries gave a lot of equipment, but they didn't have enough that literally everybody could have everything. So they had to pick and choose. And I think Zelensky is wanting it to look like it was Zaluzhny's problem, why it didn't get equitably passed along there. And then the last thing he mentions is that the generals need to go to the front, implying that Zaluzhny wasn't at the front, so he didn't know what was going on. Now they're going to have some other troops, and I think Gary's even got some video of Zelensky himself has gone to the front several times. This one here, I believe, is in the Robotina. That says here on the February 4th. Even before that, he was at Avdiivka. He went on the outskirts of that, famously took a selfie of himself in front of the city there. And he's been at the front a lot of times. So he certainly has done that. And that takes no shortage of courage to go up to the front line as the political leader. And I think he's trying to characterize himself that Zaluzhny didn't do that, and now he needs to so that he knows what happens. Now, whether he was or whether he wasn't, he didn't take a lot of pictures. That didn't seem to be his MO. But again, I think Zelensky's trying to separate himself and saying, I'm at the front. I expect all the generals to be at front. Now, as a former armor officer in a tank company, or a second in command of a tank squadron in the first armored division in Germany back in the mid 2000s, I can tell you leading from the front is a big deal. You do want your leaders at the front. We teach that as doctrine. I saw it done in mechanized combat in Desert Storm when I fought with the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Regiment. Leading from the front was always a deal. So that concept is right. Whether Zaluzhny was doing it or not, I can't really speak to, but that's the reason. So Zelensky laid out this whole picture of why Zaluzhny wasn't doing it right and that he is. And so now he's going to bring in a new guy, and it's going to be a guy named Syrsky. I think his picture's right there. Yeah, you can see General Syrsky. Alexander Syrsky is the new commander-in-chief. Now, he doesn't have a very good track record. He was the one, if I'm not mistaken, that actually said, yeah, we're going to hold Bakhmut. We're going to be able to do it. And he had the plan, the tactical plan that was supposed to hold that, and it was a disaster. So I'm not sure that he's going to be a whole lot better than Zaluzhny. And to Zaluzhny's credit, apparently he was the one that came up with the plan that actually dealt Russia their biggest losses of the war, and that was when they had that surprise offensive in the Kharkiv region in the late summer of 2022 that drove Russia back thousands of square kilometers back into, almost all the way back into Russia in some places, and put the pressure on the Russians in Kharkiv, Kherson City, that also forced the Russian commander at that time to withdraw and abandon the city. So those were the two big ones that apparently were Zaluzhny's moves there. But, that was the first year of the war. And like everybody, what have you done for me lately? Now, look, I think that asking any commanding general in Ukraine, with the constraints and the limitations they have, to be able to win on the ground, I think is an unrealistic expectation. And if you're expecting them to be able to win, if you're expecting Syrsky to be able to change the conditions or the outcomes, I think that people are going to be in for a real problem and a real shock. And U.S. people already, and some of the U.S. generals have spent the last couple of months kind of setting up some false expectations that I think we need to talk about here, because that goes into both what has happened up to this point and what we can expect going forward. And that's kind of the gist we want to talk about here, is why that is. Here is former General Twitty in December saying that if this doesn't succeed, it's going to not succeed, not because the Ukraine side didn't do a good job fighting. It's because, well, it was our fault.
If Ukraine goes to the bargaining table, or if Ukraine loses this war, you might as well say the U.S. lost the war. NATO has lost this war, because remember, we backed Ukraine from the beginning in this war. NATO backed Ukraine from the beginning of this war. And if we abandon the Ukrainians, then we have lost just as much as the Ukrainians have lost.
Now, you can't fight a war if you don't have cash, and if you don't have money to buy ammunition and weapon systems and spare parts and all of those things. And the U.S. Congress was originally supposed to have passed a $60 billion package for Ukraine in September of last year, when they were supposed to have passed a budget for our country, which also still hasn't happened. But in December, because that didn't happen, John Kirby went before the American people and said, hey, look, we're out of cash. And well, that's a problem.
Military assistance to Ukraine? I mean, has the well really run dry here, or what does it look like?
We have issued the last drawdown package that we had funding to support. And that's why it's critical that Congress move on that national security supplemental request and we get more funding. The assistance that we provided has now ground to a halt. The attacks that the Russians are conducting are only increasing. And now, as I talked about earlier this week, they're using North Korean ballistic missiles to do their dirty work. So the need is acute right now.
Now, just like General Twitty, Kirby is trying to make it sound like, look, the problem is we're not giving them enough money. And if we don't fail, they're going to succeed. Now, that's going to be a problem. That's not accurate, and I will tell you why in just a second. But here's what Kirby said just hours ago today.
We're convinced that there is strong bipartisan support on Capitol Hill for supporting Ukraine. And we know there's efforts now to bring something up onto the Senate floor for a vote that would have Ukraine, Israel, Indo-Pacific, and humanitarian assistance, so supplemental funding in it, and without the border. We'll let senators work that out. The president believes that support for Ukraine is critical, particularly right now, as Russia continues to try to hit their defense industrial base, continue to hit their units on that battlefront from east to south. It's vital, and he's confident that, and based on the meetings he's had with leaders on Capitol Hill and the discussions he's had, certainly over recent weeks, that again, the leadership, even on the House side, the leadership is solidly in support of supporting Ukraine.
So they keep saying that. The House leaders are in support of Ukraine. The Senate is in support of Ukraine. But now that we're in February, they haven't passed any since back in September. So I don't know upon what basis John Kirby is saying that that's going to happen, because again, the issue is not cash. It's the fundamentals of war. And that's one of the things that just frankly is puzzling to me, is to how our senior most leaders, I'm talking about uniformed leaders, retired leaders, former admirals like Kirby, the president of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, all of these guys keep acting as though we just need more cash and then everything's going to be fine, or they need more bullets and then maybe a few spare parts and then things will turn around. But the fundamentals are what's against Ukraine. A new general's not going to get it done. More cash isn't going to get it done because they don't have enough manpower. They have lost too many people already. They have just passed in their legislature a new mobilization bill where they're going to try to raise 500,000 more men over the coming months to try to replenish the losses that they've had, which has been catastrophic for their country. But look, they don't even have enough money to run their government right now. Even aside from what the U.S. is going to provide, it's not going to cover that. The European Union has given them a little bit here in the last few days, but it's about a third to a fourth as much money as they need. And I'm talking to just keep the lights on, to just keep the civil servants running so that the teachers have pay, et cetera, because the Ukraine economy has been so gutted, they don't have money to operate. That's not even talking about the war. That's talking to just keep the government and all of its services afloat, which is very perilous at the moment. So that's how tender or weak things are, even on the internal side, off the battlefield in Ukraine. I don't know. Right now, nobody else is talking about making up that shortfall. So I don't know what they're going to do for the remainder of this year, even just to stay alive domestically. But then fundamentally, for the military side, even if this money comes through, it's going to be somewhere into 2025, 26 before the West and the United States have enough artillery shells to be able to even bring back close to parity what the Russian side's doing. But even that's going to be, they're chasing their tail because the Russians are also increasing. But the biggest problem is the manpower issue. Ukraine simply doesn't have it to bring in. And you can throw some guys in uniform, but when you're talking about the fourth and fifth round of mobilization because all the rest of them have been killed, then it's unrealistic to think that you're going to be able to field an effective army to drive out an entrenched Russia. And Gary, if you can pull up that picture from the Institute for the Study of War, this is the current situation that we see on the ground right now. There on the left side is the area around Bakhmut. And then the area on the right is Avdiivka. You may have heard that in the news a lot lately because the Ukraine side continues to lose ground everywhere. All these, like the yellow areas you see on both the sets of maps and in the green areas there, that's where the bigger battles are going on. You see that Russia is advancing everywhere. And the situation is a little more grave than I think that some people are aware of. There was a piece earlier today in the Washington Post where they are talking about just how bad the situation is. The frontline Ukrainian infantry units report acute shortages of soldiers. See, it's not even personnel so much. And the Washington Post quoted one of the commanders that they had talked to for this interview to say, Where are we going? I don't know, he said. There's no positive outlook, absolutely none. It's going to end in a lot of death, a global failure. And most likely, I think the front will collapse somewhere like it did for the enemy in 2022 in the Kharkiv region. He's referring to that battle I told you a minute ago about where the Russians had suffered a large setback in Kharkiv in 2022. But here's the critical difference. When the Russian side had that collapse in the northern sector, it was one they had thinly defended. They were not prepared, but they still had their whole army behind, and they were able to recover, firm up the line where it went to up around the Oskol River, and then Ukraine never went past it again. Ukraine, on the other hand, has nothing. They used all of their resources up. They used all their reserves up in the Bakhmut fight. What they had rebuilt, they used most of those up in the offensive in this past summer. And now then they are throwing their final reserves into trying to a desperate attempt to hold Avdiivka, which I showed just a second ago. And they just don't have enough left. Now, if their forces break somewhere, as the Russians did in 2022, Russia has, according to the Ukraine intelligence sources, somewhere around 80,000 troops in certain areas that are poised to potentially make a breakthrough. Not talking about the ones on the line, but some of the Russian reserves. They have reserves. Russia has the industrial capacity to replace tanks with new ones or rebuilt ones. They have the ability to crank out 5-to-1 advantages in artillery. They can do those things. They have air defense capacity. They still have jets that can fire from a distance that the Ukraine side can't even shoot back at. They have attack helicopters now that are attacking on the front lines, which the Ukraine side can't defend against. All of these things are continuing to move in Russia's favor. And if that line breaks, then it's not going to matter whether the Congress comes through with money or not. It's not going to matter if we suddenly come up with a way to find a bunch of artillery shells. It's all about the manpower. War has always been about the men, not the machines, about the troops, not the cash. And that's the situation that we're in right now. And if we don't get this recognized soon and go ahead and have a negotiated settlement and get rid of this nonsense that General Twitty talked about a second ago, and he's very emblematic of what the senior so-called elite in this country and their foreign policy want to do. And you see that as of Kirby earlier today is talking about, they're still not even thinking of those terms. They still think that the cash is going to somehow make a difference. All we're doing is setting the stage for the potential collapse of the Ukrainian army, the destruction of more Ukrainian cities, the deaths of more Ukrainian civilians and military personnel, and ultimately probably a military defeat. Nothing is ever guaranteed, but right now, the way the conditions are right now, the prevailing directions of both armies in the opposite direction, there is a higher probability, new general or not, that Ukraine will lose the war and Russia will win the war. And that will blow minds all over the Western world, because even to this day, there's still an unwillingness to contemplate the reality of what I'm saying there, that the odds are higher of a Russian win than of a Ukraine even stalemate. And I know no one likes that. Nobody wants to hear it, but that is the truth. And you can see it. The fundamentals that I've shown you here, the realities that are on the ground, the reports that are coming in from the Western media. This is not Russian propaganda. I'm not even telling you what the Russian sides are saying. I'm just telling you what our own reporting is saying. I'm showing you what the map looks like by Western sources on the ground. And you know that they're already heavily slanted toward the Ukraine side, yet you see all the information is the opposite for the Ukraine side. So I hope that our leaders will finally start to do the right thing, if only for self-interest, if only because we don't want to be humiliated by seeing that Ukraine has to basically have terms of surrender, as opposed to having a negotiated settlement where maybe they can stop any more advances of the Russians, keep them from capturing any more territory, and stop the destruction of their country and the death of their people. Folks, they're never going to get back the Donbass. They're never going to get back Crimea. There is no rational path for even the possibility of that. That's fantasy right now. Who knows what may happen in the distant future? But if you don't acknowledge reality today, the more likelihood is that they're going to lose much more as time goes on. And these deaths will be pointless because they're avoidable and they won't help out. But we haven't seen a lot of evidence of wisdom among our senior class. And I don't have a good feeling for where this is going. But I'm just telling you, from an analytical position, an unemotional position. That's the landscape right now, and that's what we're facing. So yes, Ukraine has themselves a new general. They have firm words from their president, but it's not going to make any difference on the battlefield because the military fundamentals are not subject to spin. And that is your deep dive for the day. We are going to have a special edition later tonight after the heavily anticipated show with Tucker Carlson interviewing President Vladimir Putin. Very controversial situation. Some people calling Tucker a traitor. Others are saying he's just a propaganda machine for Putin. Other people are saying, well, just, hey, freedom of speech. Let's give him a chance. Let's see what he has to say. And you'll be able to make up your own mind. We'll be watching that with interest. And then we're going to come up with a kind of a rapid reaction afterwards, kind of tell you maybe some of the things you might not be able to pick up when just listening to it. We'll give you some behind the scenes things. And so be watching our show for that, watching our timeline. It'll be basically sometime after the episode is over. So thanks. We'll see you next time. And we will remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you what you need to know. Thanks. And we'll see you tonight later on. Bye-bye.